When the Henrico County Courthouse burned in 1865, most assumed the flames consumed nothing but Confederate records and debt ledgers. But courthouse clerk Josiah Pemberton wrote in his private diary that among the ashes, workers found a locked iron chest containing 23 pages of testimony so disturbing that the Reconstruction authorities ordered every copy destroyed. The testimony belonged to a woman identified only as the Silent Giant, a slave woman who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall and had not spoken a single word in 18 years. Her silence ended on March 14, 1863, when a Union surgeon examined her in a contraband camp outside Richmond. What she whispered to him about her master and her 9 daughters caused 3 witnesses to vomit, and the surgeon himself requested immediate transfer to frontline duty rather than document what he had heard. The military suppressed her account. The surgeon died of typhoid 6 weeks later, and the woman vanished from all official records. But fragments of her story survived in private letters, hidden journals, and the nightmares of those who heard it. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called Big Sarah and the plantation that consumed her children, we want to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state you are listening from. Now, let us enter the world of Greenbrier Plantation, where silence became the only mercy left. The woman who would become known as Big Sarah arrived at Greenbrier Plantation in Powhatan County, Virginia, on an August morning in 1831. The same week Nat Turner began his rebellion 70 miles to the southeast. Greenbrier sat on 2,000 acres of tobacco land along the James River, far enough from Richmond to feel isolated, but close enough that its owner, Nathaniel Crowther, could maintain business connections with the city's merchant class. The plantation house itself was an imposing 3-story structure of red brick, with white columns that Crowther had installed in 1828 to match the Greek Revival fashion sweeping through Virginia's planter elite. 12 slave cabins formed a neat row behind the main house, each structure housing between 6 and 10 people in conditions that even by the standards of 1831 were recognized as harsh. Crowther had inherited Greenbrier from his father in 1824, along with debts that had nearly destroyed the family name. At 31, he had managed to restore some of the plantation's profitability through tobacco cultivation and what he called strategic breeding programs, a practice that was becoming increasingly common as the domestic slave trade expanded and the overseas trade had been officially abolished since 1808. His wife, Constance, had died in childbirth in 1829, leaving him with no legitimate children but a plantation to run and a reputation to rebuild among the Tidewater aristocracy. The woman who stepped off the wagon that August morning was unlike any slave the other captives at Greenbrier had ever seen. She stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands so large they could palm a man's head like a melon. The slave trader who brought her, a man named Vernon Caldwell from Charleston, claimed she was 22 years old and had been born on a rice plantation in the South Carolina Low Country. He sold her to Crowther for $800, a significant sum that reflected both her size and what Caldwell described as her exceptional breeding potential. Her name, Caldwell said, was Sarah. She had been separated from a previous owner's estate after what Caldwell vaguely described as an incident of defiance. When Crowther asked what kind of defiance, Caldwell's expression hardened. He said only that Sarah had watched something happen to her mother, and since that day she had not spoken a single word to anyone, white or black. Crowther examined her teeth, her hands, her legs. He had her walk back and forth. She moved with a strange mechanical quality, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, never meeting anyone's gaze. Her silence did not trouble Crowther. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. What Crowther did not tell Caldwell or anyone else was that he had been looking for exactly this kind of woman. In the months since his wife's death, Crowther had become increasingly obsessed with what he called improving the stock of his slave population. He kept detailed records in a leather journal, documenting heights, weights, physical characteristics, and what he termed reproductive capacity. He had read treatises on animal husbandry and had begun to apply those same principles to human beings. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had never been challenged, that he could breed a generation of slaves who would be stronger, more obedient, and more valuable than any that had come before. Sarah was, in his mind, the perfect foundation for this experiment. Her height and strength meant her children would likely inherit those traits. Her silence meant she would not corrupt them with stories of freedom or resistance. And her apparent brokenness, the blank expression, the mechanical movements, suggested a spirit that had already been crushed, which meant she would not fight what was to come. The other slaves at Greenbrier watched Sarah's arrival with a mixture of curiosity and pity. An older woman named Bess, who served as the unofficial matriarch of the slave quarters, later told another captive that she knew immediately that something was wrong with Sarah. Not wrong in her mind, Bess would explain, but wrong in her soul. She had seen that look before, on people who had witnessed things so terrible that words could no longer contain them. Silence in those cases was not a weakness, but a fortress, the last defense against a world that had already taken everything else. Crowther assigned Sarah to fieldwork initially, but within 2 weeks, he had relocated her to a separate cabin, a small structure that had previously been used for storage, set apart from the other slave quarters. He told the overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Stanton, that Sarah required special management, and that she was not to be worked in the same crews as the other slaves. Stanton, who had been with Crowther for 3 years and had learned not to question his employer's stranger instructions, simply nodded and made the arrangements. That September, on the night of a new moon, Crowther visited Sarah's cabin for the first time. He carried with him a lantern, a bottle of whiskey, and a leather strap. When he emerged 2 hours later, his shirt was torn and his knuckles were bleeding, but his expression was one of satisfaction. He told Stanton the next morning that Sarah had accepted her new role, and that from now on, she was to be left entirely to his supervision. No other white man was to enter her cabin. No other slave was to speak to her unless given explicit permission. She would work in the fields during the day, but her nights belonged to Crowther alone. The other slaves knew what this meant. They had seen it happen before, though never with such calculated deliberation. Bess tried once to approach Sarah during the lunch break in the fields to offer some word of comfort or solidarity, but Sarah simply stared through her as if she were made of glass. Her silence was absolute. When Bess touched her arm, Sarah flinched so violently that she dropped her water gourd, but she made no sound. Not a gasp. Not a cry. Nothing. By December of 1831, the first signs of Sarah's pregnancy became visible. Crowther recorded the date in his journal with evident satisfaction, noting her measurements and estimating that the child would be born in late spring. He began to feed her better than the other slaves, more meat, more vegetables, milk from the plantation's dairy. He wanted to ensure, he told Stanton, that the child would be healthy and strong. He had plans for this child, and for all the children that would follow. The other slaves watched as Sarah's belly grew through the winter months. They saw how Crowther visited her cabin every few nights, how he sometimes brought cloth or small gifts that he presented to her, as if she were a prized mare in his stable. They saw how Sarah's silence deepened, how she moved through the world like a ghost in a body too large to hide. Some of the women tried to help her when they could, leaving extra food near her cabin, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement when they passed in the fields. But Sarah never responded. Her eyes remained fixed on that distant, unreachable point, and her lips stayed sealed as if they had been sewn shut. Bess would later tell her granddaughter that she could feel something dark gathering over Greenbrier that winter. The air felt heavier than it should, she said, and birds seemed to avoid the area around Sarah's cabin. Bess did not believe in curses or haunts in the traditional sense, but she believed in evil, the humankind that needed no supernatural explanation. And she believed that Nathaniel Crowther was bringing something terrible into being, something that would not be satisfied until it had consumed everything in its path. Sarah's first child was born on May 3, 1832, during a thunderstorm so violent that the oldest slaves claimed it was the worst they had seen in 20 years. The midwife, A skilled woman named Patience, who had delivered hundreds of babies on various plantations, later told Bess that the birth itself was unremarkable. The baby was large and healthy, a girl, with her mother's height already evident in her long limbs. What disturbed Patience was Sarah's complete silence throughout the labor. Most women screamed, cried, cursed, or prayed. Sarah made no sound at all. She stared at the ceiling beams of her cabin, tears streaming down her face, but her mouth remained closed. When Patience placed the baby in her arms, Sarah looked at the child with an expression that Patience would describe years later as the saddest thing I ever witnessed, ever. It was not the sadness of exhaustion or pain, but something deeper, a grief that seemed to know the future. Crowther named the child Delilah and recorded her birth in his journal with meticulous detail. 8 pounds, 3 ounces, 22 inches long. Perfect specimens, he wrote, both mother and daughter. He visited the cabin the next day with a small silver rattle, an object that seemed grotesquely out of place in the sparse, dirt-floored room. He placed it in the baby's hand and smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose investment was paying dividends. Sarah watched him with those empty eyes, holding her daughter close, and said nothing. For the first year of Delilah's life, Sarah was allowed to keep the child with her. Crowther believed, based on his readings about animal breeding, that the mother's milk and care in the early months would strengthen the child's constitution. He continued to visit Sarah's cabin regularly, and by the time Delilah turned 8 months old, Sarah was pregnant again. The pattern had been established. Crowther had no intention of stopping. The second child, Rebecca, was born in March of 1833. The third, Judith, arrived in November of that same year. The fourth, Ruth, came in July of 1834. Each pregnancy followed the same ritual: Crowther's visits, Sarah's silence, the birth attended by Patience, and the careful documentation in Crowther's journal. Each time, Sarah held her newborn daughter with that same expression of unbearable sadness, and each time she remained silent. The other slaves began to understand the full scope of Crowther's design. He was not simply taking Sarah as a concubine, as many slaveholders did. He was systematically breeding her, treating her as livestock, with the explicit goal of producing as many children as possible, and every single child was a girl. This was not by chance, the older slaves whispered, but by design. Crowther wanted daughters because daughters could be bred in turn. He was planning generations ahead, building what he called his improved line. By 1836, Sarah had given birth to 6 daughters: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi. All of them showed signs of their mother's unusual height. Delilah, at 4 years old, was already as tall as a typical 6-year-old. Crowther was delighted. He had begun to separate the older girls from their mother, assigning them to work in the main house where he could observe their development more closely. He told Stanton that he wanted them to learn domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing, so that they would be more valuable when the time came. But those who worked in the house saw how Crowther watched these little girls, how his eyes followed them with the same calculating assessment he had once directed at their mother. The female house slaves began to fear what would happen when these girls reached adolescence. Sarah saw her daughters less and less as they grew older. Crowther had decided that limiting contact between mother and children would prevent Sarah from teaching them any ideas about resistance or escape. He wanted the daughters to see their situation as natural, inevitable. He wanted them compliant and ignorant, like their mother appeared to be. What Crowther did not understand, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing, was that Sarah's silence was not compliance. It was calculation. In late 1836, 2 events occurred that would set in motion the tragedy that still haunts Powhatan County. The first was that Crowther hired a new overseer. Virgil Stanton had died in August of that year, kicked in the head by a mule in what everyone agreed was a fitting end for a cruel man. His replacement was a younger man named Edmund Yancey, recently arrived from North Carolina. Yancey was efficient and brutal, but unlike Stanton, he was also curious. He noticed things. He kept his own records. And he began to wonder about the tall, silent woman in the isolated cabin and the growing number of light-skinned girls who all bore a striking resemblance to their master. The second event was that Sarah became pregnant for the 7th time. But this pregnancy was different from the others. By the end of her second trimester, it became clear that she was carrying twins. Patients, examining her in the cabin, felt 2 distinct heads and told Crowther that he could expect 2 more daughters by spring. Crowther's excitement was almost childish. Twins meant his breeding program was even more successful than he had hoped. He doubled Sarah's food rations and forbade her from any field work. She was too valuable now to risk. The twins, Hannah and Abigail, were born on March 22, 1837. Both survived, both were healthy, and both were girls. Crowther now had 8 daughters from Sarah, ranging in age from 5-year-old Delilah to newborns Hannah and Abigail. In his journal, he calculated that if the pattern continued, Sarah could produce at least 6 more children before her childbearing years ended. He had already begun to plan for Delilah's future. She would turn 12 in 1839. By 13 or 14, she could begin bearing children herself. The cycle would continue, expanding exponentially, creating a dynasty of slaves who would make Greenbrier the most prosperous plantation in Powhatan County. But something had changed in Sarah after the twins were born. Patients noticed it first. Sarah had always been silent, but now there was something different in her eyes. Not emptiness, but intensity. She watched her newborn daughters with an expression that was no longer simply sad. It was focused, determined. For the first time in 6 years, patients saw Sarah's jaw clench with what looked like rage. On a cold night in November of 1837, 6 months after the twins' birth, screams erupted from the main house. The slaves in the quarters heard Crowther shouting, then the sound of something heavy crashing. Yancey emerged from his cabin with a pistol and ran toward the house. What he found inside would become the subject of whispered speculation for decades to come, though the official record would say almost nothing about it. 5-year-old Delilah was cowering in a corner of Crowther's study, her dress torn. Crowther himself was bleeding from a wound on his head, caused by a brass candlestick that lay on the floor. And standing in the doorway, silent as always but with her massive frame blocking any exit, was Sarah. In her hand she held a kitchen knife. She had somehow left her locked cabin, made her way to the main house, and found her daughter in Crowther's study. What exactly she had witnessed was never officially recorded, but the implications were clear to everyone present. Yancey raised his pistol, aiming at Sarah's chest. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Sarah did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Crowther for the first time since her arrival at Greenbrier 6 years earlier. She looked at him with an expression of such profound hatred that Yancey later told his wife it made his blood run cold. And then, still holding the knife, she turned and walked out of the house. She did not run. She simply walked, with that same mechanical gait, back toward her cabin. Crowther, wiping blood from his face, screamed at Yancey to shoot her. But Yancey hesitated. Something in Sarah's deliberate, calm departure had unnerved him. She was not fleeing like someone who feared punishment. She was withdrawing like someone who had accomplished exactly what she intended. Before Yancey could make a decision, Sarah had disappeared into the darkness. They found her the next morning, sitting in her cabin with her 9th daughter, a newborn she had delivered by herself during the night. No one had even known she was pregnant again. The baby, whom Crowther would name Miriam, was small but alive. Sarah sat holding her, dried blood on her thighs, the kitchen knife placed deliberately on the floor in front of her. She stared straight ahead, silent as always, waiting for whatever would come next. Crowther was faced with a dilemma. By law and custom, Sarah's attack on a white man, even in defense of her daughter, was a capital offense. He could have her hanged or sold away, but doing so would mean losing his breeding program, his improved line, and the fortune he believed these children represented. After a week of deliberation, he made his decision. Sarah would be punished, but not killed. She would be locked in her cabin permanently, let out only for necessary physical maintenance. She would no longer see her daughters at all, and to ensure she could never attack anyone again, Crowther had a blacksmith forge an iron collar that would remain around her neck permanently, attached to a chain bolted to the wall of her cabin. The chain was long enough that she could move around the small space, but not long enough to reach the door. The other slaves watched in horror as this sentence was carried out. Bess wept openly, which earned her 10 lashes from Yancey. The house slaves who had cared for Sarah's daughters were forbidden from speaking about what had happened. And Edmund Yancey, who had seen something in that moment in Crowther's study that he could not quite articulate, began to keep a secret journal of his own, a record of observations that would prove crucial years later. Sarah's punishment began in December of 1837. For the next 4 years, she lived in that cabin, chained like an animal, visited only by Crowther for his purposes and by patients when births required medical attention. She gave birth to her 9th daughter in that first year of captivity. She never saw Delilah again. She never held Rebecca or Judith or any of her other children, and she never ever spoke. But silence, as Bess had understood years earlier, can be a weapon, and Sarah was sharpening hers with every passing day. The years between 1837 and 1845 transformed Greenbrier Plantation into something that even neighboring slaveholders found disturbing. Crowther's obsession with his breeding program had evolved into a mania that consumed his every waking thought. He had converted 2 rooms of the main house into what he called his study of human husbandry, filling them with charts, measurements, and daguerreotype images of Sarah's daughters at various ages. He corresponded with agricultural societies and even some medical professionals, though he was careful to phrase his inquiries in abstract terms that did not reveal the full scope of his experiments. The daughters themselves grew in their separate spheres, each one developing under Crowther's watchful eye. Delilah, the eldest, turned 13 in 1845. She had inherited her mother's height and was nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of striking appearance that drew attention wherever she went. Crowther had trained her in household management and had begun introducing her to visitors as his ward, a fiction that fooled no one but satisfied his need for social respectability. What happened in the private hours between Crowther and Delilah was known only to the house slaves who changed the sheets and heard the sounds that echoed through the corridors at night. Rebecca, Judith, and Ruth worked in the house as well, learning skills that Crowther claimed would make them valuable as skilled slaves. Esther and Naomi, slightly younger, helped in the kitchen under the supervision of the cook, an elderly woman named Dinah, who treated the girls with a gentleness that bordered on defiance. The youngest 3, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, still lived in the slave quarters, though Crowther had them brought to the main house regularly for what he called inspections. Throughout these years, Sarah remained chained in her cabin. The other slaves rarely saw her. Crowther had the cabin's windows boarded up from the outside, supposedly to prevent her from signaling to others, but the real reason seemed to be that he wanted her existence erased from view. Food was left at her door twice a day. Once a week, she was allowed outside, still chained, to walk in a small fenced area behind her cabin. During these brief moments of semi-freedom, the other slaves would sometimes catch glimpses of her. They reported that she had changed. Her hair had gone completely grey. Her body, though still massive, had taken on a gauntness that suggested inadequate nutrition despite Crowther's claims of proper care. But her eyes, those who dared to look into them, said her eyes had become something else entirely. Not empty anymore, but burning. Edmund Yancey continued to keep his secret journal during these years, documenting observations that troubled him increasingly. He noted the ages of the daughters and the timing of when Crowther's nocturnal visits to their rooms began. He recorded the tears he saw on Delilah's face at breakfast the morning after her 13th birthday, and the way Rebecca flinched when Crowther touched her shoulder when she turned 12. Yancey was no abolitionist. He believed in slavery and enforced it brutally, but he found himself repulsed by what he was witnessing. There was slavery, and then there was this. Even he could see the difference. In September of 1845, a Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Sheffield visited Greenbrier as part of his rounds through Powhatan County. Crowther was not a particularly religious man, but he maintained appearances for social standing, and he allowed Sheffield to preach to the slaves on Sunday afternoons. Sheffield was a thin, intense man in his 40s, genuinely committed to spreading the gospel, even to those in bondage. Unlike many white preachers of the era, he actually seemed to care about the spiritual welfare of enslaved people, though his understanding of justice was limited by the blinders of his time and place. During his visit, Sheffield noticed the unusual number of mixed-race girls at Greenbrier, all bearing a striking resemblance to each other. He commented on this to Crowther, who explained with barely concealed pride that these were the daughters of a particular slave woman who possessed exceptional breeding qualities. Sheffield's expression darkened. He asked if he might speak with this woman to provide spiritual counsel. Crowther refused, claiming she was unwell and could not receive visitors. Something in his refusal made Sheffield suspicious. That evening, Sheffield spoke quietly with some of the older slaves, including Bess. What she told him, carefully, knowing the danger of speaking too freely to any white man, horrified him. She did not mention Crowther's sexual violence explicitly, but she spoke of Sarah's chains, her isolation, and the sorrow that hung over the plantation like a fog. She mentioned that Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, that she had been separated from her 9 daughters, that she lived in darkness. Sheffield understood enough to grasp the full picture. The next morning, before leaving Greenbrier, Sheffield confronted Crowther directly. It was a brave act, possibly foolish, for a circuit preacher with no wealth or power. He told Crowther that what he was doing was an abomination before God, that no amount of property rights could justify such treatment of a human being, that even within the institution of slavery there were lines that should not be crossed. Crowther listened with an expression of cold amusement, then informed Sheffield that he was no longer welcome at Greenbrier. If Sheffield made any public accusations, Crowther warned, he would sue him for defamation and use his considerable influence to have Sheffield removed from the Methodist ministry. Sheffield left, shaken and angry, but ultimately powerless. However, Sheffield did something that would prove significant later. He wrote a detailed letter to his bishop, describing what he had witnessed at Greenbrier without naming Crowther directly. He also sent a copy to a fellow minister in Richmond who had expressed sympathy with the more reform-minded elements of the Methodist Church. These letters would sit in church archives, forgotten until the Civil War brought them back to light. In December of 1845, something changed in Sarah's cabin. Patients, who still attended to Sarah's medical needs, noticed it during a routine visit. Sarah had begun scratching marks on the walls, lines arranged in groups of 5 like a prisoner counting days. But these marks did not seem to be counting time linearly. Instead, they were arranged in 9 columns, each column containing a different number of marks. When patients looked more closely, she realized with a chill that each column corresponded to one of Sarah's daughters. Sarah was tracking them, tracking their ages, counting. Patience said nothing to Crowther about this discovery. But that night, lying in her own bed in the slave quarters, she found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about those marks on the wall, the methodical precision of them, the organization. Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, but she was not silent in her mind. She was remembering. She was planning. And somehow, Patience knew that whatever Sarah was planning would be terrible. The spring of 1846 brought changes to Greenbrier that would accelerate the coming disaster. Crowther, now 53 years old and increasingly confident in his breeding program's success, decided to expand his operations. He purchased 3 more slave women specifically selected for their height and physical strength, intending to replicate his success with Sarah. He also constructed 3 new cabins near Sarah's, each designed with the same isolation features: boarded windows, reinforced doors, and iron rings embedded in the floor for chains. The other slaves watched these preparations with growing dread. They understood what Crowther intended, and they knew that Sarah's fate would be replicated 3 times over. But Crowther had become sloppy in his confidence. He spent more time in Richmond, socializing with other planters, and even presenting a paper to an agricultural society about improved breeding techniques for the labor force that was abstract enough to be respectable, but specific enough that some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. During his absences, the day-to-day management of Greenbrier fell increasingly to Edmund Yancey, whose private disgust with Crowther's methods had matured into something resembling a crisis of conscience. Yancey had never considered himself a moral man. He had whipped slaves, separated families, and enforced the brutal discipline that kept the plantation running. But Crowther's systematic sexual exploitation of Sarah and his daughters crossed a line that even Yancey found intolerable. It was not that Yancey believed slavery was wrong. He did not. But he believed that even within that evil institution, there were rules, boundaries, traditions that separated civilization from savagery. Crowther had abandoned all of that in pursuit of his obsession. In April of 1846, Yancey did something that would have gotten him killed if Crowther had discovered it. He unlocked Sarah's cabin door one afternoon while Crowther was in Richmond and stood at the threshold, not entering, but looking inside. Sarah sat on her straw mattress, the iron collar around her neck, the chain stretching to the wall. She looked at him with those burning eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Yancey spoke. He said, "I know what he has done to you. I know what he is doing to your daughters. I cannot stop him. But I want you to know that someone sees it. Someone knows." Sarah stared at him, her expression unchanging. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed toward the wall where she had scratched her marks, the 9 columns representing her 9 daughters. Yancey looked at those marks and understood. She was not asking for sympathy. She was making sure he knew she was counting. Making sure someone would remember, when the time came, how many there were, how many had been violated, how many had been stolen from her. Yancey nodded, locked the door and walked away, feeling like he had just witnessed something that would haunt him until his death. That summer, Delilah became pregnant. She was 14 years old. The father was obviously Crowther, though he never acknowledged this publicly. The house slaves watched her belly grow with a mixture of pity and horror, understanding that Crowther's plan had entered its next phase. He was breeding the 2nd generation now. His improved line was expanding exactly as he had designed it. When Dinah, the elderly cook, tried to comfort Delilah one evening in the kitchen, the girl broke down sobbing. She whispered through her tears that she wanted to die, that she had tried to throw herself down the stairs, but Rebecca had stopped her, that she could not bear what was happening to her. Dinah held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. There were no words adequate to this particular kind of suffering. In September, something extraordinary happened. A slave named Josiah, who worked in the stables, was making repairs to Sarah's cabin when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a voice, low, rough from disuse, but unmistakably human. Sarah was speaking, not to him, not to anyone present, but to herself. She was reciting names: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, Miriam, over and over, like a prayer or an incantation. Josiah finished his repairs quickly and left without saying anything, but he told Bess what he had heard. Bess's blood ran cold. Sarah had been silent for 15 years, and now she was speaking again, speaking her daughters' names in the darkness of her prison. It felt like something was awakening, something that had been waiting a very long time. October brought tragedy and revelation in equal measure. Rebecca, who was 12 years old, tried to run away. She made it 15 miles before slave catchers found her hiding in a barn. They brought her back to Greenbrier in chains, and Crowther had her whipped in front of all the other slaves as an example. 20 lashes, methodically applied by Yancey, who later wrote in his journal that it was the worst thing he had ever done. Rebecca screamed through the first 10 lashes, then went silent for the last 10, her mind retreating to wherever people go when the body can no longer protect them. When it was over, Crowther announced that Rebecca would be sold away within the week. He had decided she was a bad influence on her sisters. This announcement caused something unexpected to happen. Delilah, her belly now visibly swollen with Crowther's child, stepped forward and spoke in front of everyone. She said, "You cannot sell her. She is my sister. If you sell her, I will tell everyone in Richmond what you have done to us. I will stand on a street corner and tell everyone who will listen." The slaves held their breath. No one spoke to Crowther this way. Certainly no slave, and especially not a pregnant 14-year-old girl. Crowther's face turned purple with rage. He stepped toward Delilah, raising his hand to strike her. But then he stopped. He looked at her pregnant belly, his investment, his future profits, and lowered his hand. He said through gritted teeth that Rebecca would not be sold, but she would spend the next month in the root cellar beneath the kitchen with minimal food and water to contemplate her sins. Delilah had won a small victory, but everyone present understood it would not be forgotten. That night, Yancey broke his own rules again. He went to Sarah's cabin and, speaking through the door, told her what had happened with Delilah and Rebecca. He told her that Delilah was pregnant. He told her that Rebecca had tried to escape. He did not know why he felt compelled to do this, perhaps because Sarah had no other way of knowing what was happening to her daughters, perhaps because he felt she had a right to know, or perhaps because he needed someone to understand the full scope of what was unfolding. When he finished speaking, there was silence. Then, from inside the cabin, he heard Sarah's voice for the first time. It was deeper than he expected, roughened by years of disuse. She said only 3 words: "They are mine." Yancey felt ice run down his spine. He understood that Sarah was not speaking of possession, but of identity. Those girls were hers. They came from her body. And what was happening to them was happening to her. He walked away from the cabin feeling certain that something terrible was building, some storm that had been gathering for 15 years, and that when it finally broke, it would destroy everything in its path. November of 1846 marked 15 years since Sarah's arrival at Greenbrier. During those 15 years, she had given birth to 9 daughters. She had been raped hundreds of times. She had been chained like an animal for 9 years. She had watched her eldest daughter follow her into the same nightmare. And through all of it, she had maintained her silence, not from compliance or defeat, but from something else entirely. Something patient, something that knew how to wait. Just when we thought we understood the full horror of what was happening at Greenbrier, the situation intensifies in ways that will shock even those familiar with the darkest chapters of American history. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens when Sarah's silence finally breaks. On December 1st, 1846, Delilah gave birth to a son. It was the first male child born from Crowther's breeding program, and his excitement was almost manic. He named the boy Nathaniel Jr. and announced to the house slaves that this child represented the future of Greenbrier. A son meant continuity, legitimacy in his twisted mind. He could claim the boy as his heir, though everyone knew the truth about his parentage. What Crowther did not anticipate was Delilah's reaction to her son. The moment she held the infant, something shifted in her. The house slaves saw it, a hardening around her eyes, a straightening of her spine despite her exhaustion. She looked at this baby boy born from violence and exploitation and made a decision that would echo through the coming months. She refused to nurse him. When Crowther demanded she feed the child, she turned her face to the wall and said nothing. They brought in a wet nurse, another enslaved woman named Flora, but Delilah's rejection of her own son created a tension in the household that everyone could feel. Yancey noted in his journal that Delilah seemed to be following her mother's example of strategic silence. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, moved through the house like a shadow, and kept her eyes down except when she thought no one was watching. In those unguarded moments, Yancey caught expressions on her face that reminded him disturbingly of Sarah. That same burning intensity, that same sense of someone counting, calculating, waiting. The winter of 1847 was brutal. Snow fell early and stayed late, trapping everyone at Greenbrier for weeks at a time. The isolation seemed to amplify the darkness that had settled over the plantation. Crowther spent more time in the main house, drinking heavily, obsessively checking on his daughters and documenting their development in his journals. He had begun to turn his attention to 13-year-old Judith, and the house slaves knew what that meant. The cycle was continuing, expanding, consuming. In February, something happened that would prove to be a turning point. Rebecca, who had spent her month in the root cellar the previous fall and emerged, changed, quieter, harder, was caught teaching some of the younger slaves to read using a stolen Bible. Literacy among slaves was illegal in Virginia, and teaching reading was considered a dangerous subversion. Crowther was furious. He had Rebecca whipped again, 10 lashes this time. But even through the punishment, she remained silent. When it was over, she looked at Crowther with an expression of such pure contempt that he actually stepped backward. That night, Yancey made his most dangerous decision yet. He went to Sarah's cabin with a lantern and unlocked the door. He stepped inside for the first time since her imprisonment began 9 years earlier. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed body, waste, despair. Sarah sat in the corner, the chain attached to her iron collar, her grey hair hanging in matted clumps. But when she raised her eyes to look at him, Yancey saw intelligence there, focus, purpose. He told her everything. He told her about Delilah's baby, about Rebecca's whipping, about Judith's future. He told her that Crowther planned to start breeding the younger daughters as soon as they reached puberty. He told her that the new cabins were ready for the 3 new women Crowther had purchased. He told her that the evil was expanding, multiplying, and that he did not know how to stop it but felt she deserved to know. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice rough but clear. "How long until spring?" The question startled Yancey. He said it was February, so perhaps 2 months. Sarah nodded slowly. Then she asked, "Where do they keep the keys?" Yancey understood immediately what she was asking. The keys to all the chains, all the locks, all the cabins. He told her they hung in Crowther's study on a hook behind his desk. Sarah absorbed this information, then said, "Go now. Do not come back. When it happens, say you knew nothing." Yancey wanted to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He left the cabin, locked the door, and returned to his own quarters, feeling like he had just set something irreversible in motion. March brought warmer weather and increased activity at Greenbrier. Crowther announced he would be hosting a gathering of neighboring planters in April, a social event designed to show off his success and rebuild his standing among the Tidewater elite. He wanted Greenbrier to look prosperous, orderly, civilized. He had the house slaves working constantly to prepare, and he made plans to display his improved stock, meaning Sarah's daughters, as examples of his breeding program's success. The daughters themselves understood what this meant. They would be paraded before other white men, evaluated like livestock, their future fates sealed. During these preparations, strange things began to happen. Tools went missing from the workshop. A section of fence near Sarah's cabin collapsed for no apparent reason. The lock on the smokehouse was found broken one morning, though nothing seemed to have been stolen. Yancey investigated these incidents but could find no explanation. The other slaves claimed ignorance, but he noticed they seemed tense, expectant, as if waiting for something. On March 15, 1847, Patience was called to Sarah's cabin for what Crowther described as a routine medical check. When Patience entered the cabin, she found Sarah sitting calmly on her mattress, the chain pulled beside her. She had somehow removed the iron collar from her neck. The metal was bent, twisted by sheer force until the lock mechanism had broken. Patience stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Sarah's neck where the collar had left deep scars. Sarah looked at her and said, "Tell him nothing. Tell him I was sick and you gave me medicine. Tell him I am weak." Patience, terrified, but also moved by something she saw in Sarah's eyes, nodded and backed out of the cabin. She reported to Crowther exactly what Sarah had instructed, adding that Sarah seemed to be suffering from a fever and should not be disturbed. Crowther, preoccupied with his party preparations, accepted this report without question. What Patience did not tell anyone was what else she had seen in that cabin. Scratched into the wall in 9 columns were the names of Sarah's daughters, and beneath each name was a series of marks, counts of something Patience did not fully understand. But the pattern was clear. Sarah had been tracking not just her daughters' ages, but their menstrual cycles. She knew with precision which of her daughters was currently fertile, and she knew when Crowther would likely visit their rooms. She had been documenting his patterns for years, counting the days between his assaults, predicting his movements with the accuracy of someone who had studied her enemy with absolute focus. The week before Crowther's planned gathering, Yancey noticed that Sarah's cabin had gone completely silent. No sounds came from within. The food left at her door remained untouched. He reported this to Crowther, who seemed annoyed rather than concerned. Crowther said Sarah was probably being dramatic and that she would eat when she got hungry enough. He instructed Yancey to leave her alone until after the party. He did not want any disruptions. But Sarah was not being dramatic. She was preparing. During those days of apparent silence, she had been systematically weakening the boards of her cabin's back wall, working at them with patient, methodical determination. She had been testing the weight of her chain, calculating how it could be used as a weapon. She had been listening to the sounds of the plantation, learning the rhythms of who walked where and when. And she had been thinking about her daughters, all 9 of them, and what she needed to do to save them from her fate. April 3rd, 1847, dawned clear and warm. Crowther's gathering was scheduled for that evening, and the plantation buzzed with final preparations. 20 planters from across Powhatan and surrounding counties would be arriving, along with their wives and older sons. Crowther had arranged for a lavish dinner, entertainment, and a tour of his facilities, where he planned to present his theories on agricultural improvement, his euphemism for his breeding program. The house slaves worked frantically all day. Dinah and her helpers prepared an elaborate meal. Delilah, Rebecca, and the other older daughters were dressed in clean clothing and instructed to serve the guests. Crowther reminded them repeatedly to smile, to be pleasant, to demonstrate the docility and refinement that his program had produced. The girls moved through these preparations like sleepwalkers, their faces masks of forced compliance. At sunset, the guests began to arrive in their carriages. The sound of horses, laughter, and conversation filled the air. Crowther stood on the front steps of the main house, greeting each arrival with exaggerated warmth. The party moved inside, and soon the dining room echoed with the sounds of men discussing tobacco prices, politics, and the growing tensions over slavery that were beginning to fracture the nation. What none of them knew was that in her cabin, Sarah had finished her preparations. She had removed the weakened boards from the back wall, creating an opening just large enough for her massive frame to squeeze through. She had wrapped sections of her chain around her hands and forearms, turning it into both armor and weapon. And she had made a decision about what came next. A decision that had been forming for 16 years, since the first night Crowther had entered her cabin with his lantern and his leather strap. At precisely 8 o'clock, as dinner was being served and Crowther was standing to make a toast, Sarah emerged from her cabin. She moved through the darkness with surprising speed for someone who had been chained for 9 years. Her body remembering freedom, even if her mind had never forgotten imprisonment. She made her way not toward the main house, but toward the quarters where her youngest daughters, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, slept. She entered the cabin silently, waking them with a hand over each girl's mouth. When they saw her, they did not scream. Despite years of separation, they knew her instantly. Some recognition deeper than memory told them this giant woman was their mother. Sarah did not speak to them. She simply gestured for them to follow, and they did, climbing out of their beds and trailing behind her through the darkness. She led them away from the plantation buildings, toward the tree line that marked the edge of Crowther's property. There, hidden in the shadows, she had them wait. Then she turned back toward Greenbrier. The house slaves who witnessed what happened next would carry those memories to their graves, and their testimony would become the fragmented record that survived. Sarah entered the main house through the kitchen door, which had been left open due to the heat of cooking. She moved through the corridors with purpose, the chain still wrapped around her arms, making soft clicking sounds against the walls. When she reached Crowther's study, she found what she was looking for, the ring of keys hanging behind his desk, just as Yancey had described. With the keys in hand, Sarah moved to the upstairs bedrooms. She unlocked the doors where Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi slept. She woke each one, placed a finger to her lips for silence, and gestured for them to follow. The daughters, understanding instinctively that this was escape or death or possibly both, followed without question. Sarah led them down the back stairs, through the kitchen where Dinah stood frozen with a ladle in her hand, and out into the night. It was only when Sarah and all 9 of her daughters were gone that someone in the dining room noticed the silence. The sounds from the kitchen had stopped. One of the house slaves who had been serving had disappeared. Crowther, annoyed at the disruption, excused himself to investigate. When he entered the kitchen and found it empty, confusion turned to alarm. He called for Yancey, who came running with several other white men from the party. They searched the house first, then the quarters. Then finally someone thought to check Sarah's cabin. They found it empty, the back wall torn open, the chain lying in a coil on the dirt floor like a shed skin. Panic spread through the gathering. Crowther screamed orders, lanterns were lit, dogs were released. A hunting party formed quickly, 20 armed white men on horseback, determined to recapture the escaped slaves before they could reach freedom or, worse, inspire others to follow. But Sarah had planned for this too. She led her daughters not north toward freedom, as the hunters expected, but south and east, toward the James River. She knew the terrain from her years of watching, listening, and counting. She knew where the water ran fast enough to hide their scent from dogs. She knew which paths would be hardest to track. And she knew something else that none of the hunters suspected. She had been communicating with other slaves for months, through patients, who had been secretly carrying messages without fully understanding their content. The hunting party split into groups, searching in multiple directions. They rode hard through the night, calling out threats and promises alternately. But as dawn broke on April 4th, they had found nothing. No tracks, no trail, no sign of Sarah or her daughters. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Crowther was frantic. His entire breeding program, his future fortune, his social standing, everything depended on recovering those women. He offered a reward of $500 for information leading to their capture, an enormous sum that had slave catchers from 3 counties joining the search. But days passed, then weeks, and still nothing. What actually happened to Sarah and her daughters became the subject of speculation and legend. Some said they made it to the Underground Railroad and eventually to freedom in Canada. Others claimed they died in the wilderness, unable to survive without resources. Still others whispered that Sarah had killed her daughters herself rather than let them be recaptured. A mercy killing that was simultaneously the most terrible and most loving act imaginable. But there was one witness who saw something that suggested a different truth. Edmund Yancey, who had joined the search party but found himself increasingly reluctant to actually find his quarry, was riding alone along the James River on the 3rd day of searching when he came upon a sight that would haunt him forever. On a small sandbar in the middle of the river, he saw 9 piles of stones, each pile carefully arranged, each topped with a small wooden cross made from tied sticks. The crosses were crude but deliberate. Someone had taken the time to build markers, to create graves or memorials. And standing in the water near the sandbar, just her head visible above the surface, was Sarah. Their eyes met across the water. Yancey did not raise his rifle. He did not call out to the others. He simply sat on his horse, watching as Sarah slowly submerged, disappearing beneath the brown water of the James. He waited for her to resurface, but she never did. The current was strong there, and the river was deep. Whether she drowned intentionally or was simply pulled under, Yancey never knew. But he understood that those 9 stone piles represented something, perhaps graves for her daughters, perhaps symbols of something else entirely. Yancey turned his horse around and rode back to Greenbrier. He told Crowther he had seen nothing. The official search continued for another month, but no trace of Sarah or her daughters was ever found. The aftermath of Sarah's escape destroyed Nathaniel Crowther more thoroughly than any direct confrontation could have. His breeding program was exposed when investigators began asking questions about the 9 missing slave women, all daughters of the same mother, all of them remarkably similar in appearance to their owner. Neighboring planters, who had always suspected something unseemly about Crowther's operation, now had confirmation of just how far beyond the pale he had gone. Even in a society that accepted slavery and the sexual exploitation that often came with it, Crowther's systematic multi-generational program of forced breeding struck many as a bridge too far. The social ostracism was swift and total. Families who had attended his party refused to speak to him. Business connections dried up. His creditors, sensing vulnerability, called in debts. Within 6 months, Crowther was forced to sell Greenbrier at a fraction of its value. He moved to Richmond, where he lived in increasing squalor and paranoia, convinced that he saw Sarah's face in crowds, heard her footsteps in the night. He died in 1852, at age 59, found in his rented room having apparently drunk himself to death. His obituary made no mention of children, legitimate or otherwise. Edmund Yancey left Greenbrier shortly after the escape and never worked as an overseer again. He moved to Charlottesville and opened a small general store. His private journal, discovered after his death in 1881, provided much of the detailed information about life at Greenbrier during those terrible years. In his final entry, dated 3 days before he died, he wrote, "I have spent 34 years trying to forget what I saw at that plantation. I have failed. Every night, I dream of a woman's face in the river, and I wake up grateful that she got away, even if getting away meant drowning. Some prisons are worse than death. She understood that. I hope her daughters understood it too." The fate of Sarah's 9 daughters remains one of the great mysteries of pre-Civil War Virginia. Despite intensive searches and a reward that stayed in effect for 5 years, no trace of them was ever found. No slave catchers reported captures matching their descriptions. No newspaper accounts from Canada or northern states mentioned their arrival. They simply vanished. However, there are intriguing fragments of possible evidence scattered through various archives. A Methodist minister's letter from 1848 mentions meeting a group of remarkably tall mulatto women at a Quaker safe house in Pennsylvania, women who refused to give their names or speak about their past. A diary entry from a schoolteacher in Ontario in 1852 describes 9 sisters, all uncommonly tall, who arrived from the south and kept entirely to themselves, speaking rarely even to each other. An 1867 census record from a small farming community in Michigan lists a family headed by Sarah D., age 35, colored with 8 sisters, though the surname is illegible due to water damage. Could these references all point to Sarah's daughters, having survived and made new lives for themselves? Or were they entirely different people, their similarities to Sarah's children merely coincidental? The historical record provides no definitive answer. What is known with certainty is that Greenbrier Plantation never recovered from the events of April 1847. The property changed hands 3 times in 15 years, with each owner reporting financial difficulties and an inability to keep enslaved workers on the land. Slaves assigned to Greenbrier reported feeling watched, hearing voices at night, finding unexplained marks scratched into walls, 9 vertical lines repeated over and over. Superstitious beliefs grew around the place, and by the time of the Civil War, Greenbrier had been effectively abandoned. The plantation house burned in 1864 during Union General Philip Sheridan's Valley Campaign, though Greenbrier was technically outside the campaign's path. Some historians believe Confederate deserters might have set the fire. Others think it might have been freed slaves settling old scores. The ruins stood for decades, slowly collapsing, until finally the last walls fell in 1923. Today, the site where Greenbrier once stood is an empty field, reclaimed by Virginia scrub pine and honeysuckle. A historical marker installed in 1994 makes brief mention of the plantation's existence, but says nothing about Sarah or her daughters. Local historians who know the full story have debated whether to push for a more comprehensive marker, one that tells the truth about what happened there. So far, no consensus has been reached. But there is one memorial that might be considered unofficial and unintentional. Along the James River, about 3 miles from where Greenbrier once stood, there is a sandbar that appears during low water in late summer. On this sandbar, visitors sometimes report finding piles of stones arranged in groups. The stones are smooth river rocks, and the piles seem too deliberately placed to be natural formations. Local teenagers, unaware of the history, sometimes knock them over. But the next summer, the piles always return, rebuilt by unknown hands. Are these the same memorial piles that Edmund Yancey saw in 1847? Almost certainly not. The river shifts its sandbars constantly, and nothing made of stone would survive unchanged for over a century. But the piles keep appearing, as if some tradition has taken hold, passed down through generations by people who might not even know why they are building monuments to 9 women who disappeared into the American darkness more than 170 years ago. The final word on Sarah and her daughters came from an unexpected source. In 1908, a woman named Clara Pemberton donated her late father's papers to the Virginia Historical Society. Josiah Pemberton had been the Henrico County courthouse clerk who witnessed the destruction of Sarah's testimony in 1865. Among his papers was a single sheet that he had apparently hidden from the military authorities, a fragment of the original transcript. It contained Sarah's response to a question about why she had remained silent for so long. Her answer, recorded in the meticulous handwriting of a Union Army scribe, read, "Words are what they use to lie. I had no words left that had not been stolen or twisted, so I saved my silence like a knife, sharp and clean, until the moment I could use it to cut us free. My daughters learned from my silence that survival is not the same as submission, that waiting is not the same as accepting, that a woman who does not speak may still be planning how to burn the world that tried to break her." This mystery shows us that the darkest chapters of American history are often the ones we try hardest to forget, but that forgetting serves no one except those who would prefer their crimes remain hidden. Sarah's story is not unique. It represents the experiences of countless women whose names and faces have been erased from historical memory, whose suffering was so ordinary within the context of slavery that it barely warranted documentation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Sarah and her daughters made it to freedom, or did they perish in the attempt? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.